when I was at school in the 1990s, computing wasn't a subject at GCSEs. It's not something that you could study. I did something called Applied ICT at A-level, and I really enjoyed it. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to go to university, I'm going to do computer science and business, because that kind of sounds the same as ICT, and I fell straight into the deep end straight away, because it was nothing like ICT at all. So I can empathise with today's students who take programming and find it, completely overwhelming, because I was one of those people for most of my degree. I graduated in 2006, and then I started teaching for a scheme called Teach First. It's the same scheme that Peter Kemp is on, and he was in the year above me, so that's how I got to know Peter as well. And he was always there to offer advice. I taught for 6 years in an inner city London school, and then I taught for a year in Seychelles, working with reception age kids all the way through to Key Stage 4. And I'm currently the head of computing at Greenwich Free School, where I've been for 3 years. So hopefully I can reflect on what I've learned over the past 10 years and all the mistakes I've made, and so you don't have to make those same mistakes, or maybe you think that actually they're perfectly valid mistakes to make. I'm going to start at the macro level, so I'm going to talk about 5 things at the macro level, and then I'll zoom into the classroom and talk about 5 things there. So to talk about the macro level, I'm going to talk about 5 fallacies in computing education, which I think I've certainly made these mistakes or fallen into these traps, and I think a lot of teachers do as well. And it's kind of like to dispel this. And the first one is that students born in the 21st century are digital natives. And this is often held belief by parents, by senior leaders, and even some teachers of computing. But I think this is really dangerous because of how far from the truth it is. If we thought that all students, it would be really absurd if we said that all students are born literate and numerate. People would say that's ridiculous. But people often say that, kids these days they're digital natives, they're computer literate, they're really great at using an iPad. And we saw in, I think, was it Dominic's session where there was a 1-year-old using an iPad. I don't really see that as being digitally literate. I don't really see that as fulfilling the computing curriculum. So I think when people say, they're digital natives, I feel as though, as computing teachers, we have to recognise that that's an absolute fallacy, and that everyone in this room knows a lot more about computing than their students. And going in and thinking they might know more than me is a bit of a trap. And we talked about imposter syndrome earlier today. We definitely know more than our students, particularly when it comes to the right tool for the right job, and also appropriate use as well, when we should use certain things. So I think that's one thing that people could learn from and overcome as well. The second one is that computing is all about code and programming. So often the media will use terms like computing, computer science, coding and programming interchangeably as though they're the same thing. When actually computing and programming pedagogy, they're really important, but that's not what computing is about for me. It's much broader than that. And IT and digital literacy is still equally important. Even though ICT GCSE is no longer there are still IT qualifications at GCSE, and those digital skills, we can't just ignore them, so we can't just think, let's scrap all our old curriculum and just teach programming, because I think that does our students a bit of a disservice. I think that all our students should experience programming, they should be exposed to it, and then let them decide, is this something for me, or is it not? But actually just, forcing the kids through, let's say, 5 years of it is probably not ideal. And then also alongside that, there's the theoretical content, and I think that's quite important as well. The next fallacy is a busy and quiet classroom where all students are working hard is a good indication that everyone is learning. I used to think that when I walked into the classroom and it was really quiet, I thought, this teacher's great, the kids are really well behaved, but there's a guy called Graham Nuttall who wrote this book called The Hidden Lives of Learners, and he says that actually walking into a quiet classroom, just noise and what the kids are doing is a really poor proxy for learning. And the only way that we know what the students have learned is through assessment. And there's so much work that's done on assessment for learning by people like Dylan William, by people like Doug Lamont as well. And I think not only is it difficult for us to see what the students are thinking, it's really difficult for the students to see what we're thinking. So when we're programming, or when we're using, say, I don't know, a video editor, or when we're using 3D graphics animation, we have to essentially think aloud. So Collins calls it thinking aloud, and he talks about cognitive apprenticeship and how we have to think out the problem aloud, because all the things which are implicit to us may not, we have to make those explicit, because the kids won't know, why are we indenting here, why are we closing a bracket here, why is there a speech mark here, why do we use this kind of bracket here. So it's really important that we all also vocalise that as well. The fourth fallacy is mistakes are bad, and the best lessons are the ones that look effortless. So I think it's really important that we teach our students to embrace their mistakes. Because according to Mark Clarkson, who's a really amazing head of department, he says that actually mistakes are the best ways for students to learn computing. Teaching computing and computing as a subject is like no other subject, in that for most of the time you'll be getting stuff wrong. Mm-hmm. As soon as you start building something, be it in Scratch, be it in Python, or any other package that you're using, iMovie, Photoshop, from the moment you click something, it's not the same as a finished product. It's already broken to start with, and you're constantly having to tinker, you're constantly having to fix. And if students get into this mindset that, oh, it's not okay if I make a mistake, I need to cover those up, I'll just stay quiet in the corner, then they won't progress as much. And Mark Clarkson essentially says that we have to celebrate the mistakes and let them know that the students need to know that you are going to fail often, and that's perfectly okay. It's perfectly okay because it shows that you're taking risks. Matthew Syed, he writes in his book Bounce that by taking risks and moving you out of your comfort zone, that's the only way to really learn and perform at a high level, that you have to push yourself slightly outside of that comfort zone. And Vygotsky might talk about the zone of proximal development. I think that's definitely applicable in computing as well, that this is something that's slightly outside their comfort zone as well. The same can be said for teachers as well. It's not our great lessons that we need to really pay attention to. It's actually our poorer lessons that allow us to reflect and allow us to think of why that didn't work, and we should really dig deep into those lessons. People very rarely reflect when they do well. If, say for example, in sport, you win a race or you come first, you don't really question why. And I'd say it's important to question why, not only when you make the mistakes or when a lesson idea completely falls apart, but also to question why it was that certain lessons worked so well. Why was that when I taught this topic to this year group in this way, why is it that they grasped it so well? It's possible that actually the lessons where it's effortless perfection, where you're just almost like the sage on the stage and the students are doing the work, everyone finishes the work, it's possible that actually the work was just too easy. So the lessons that went well, possibly are the ones where everyone was just coasting. Perhaps they were just doing things which they'd already done before, and they weren't really pushing themselves. So mistakes are really good, pushing ourselves is really good, and I think failure is really good as well, even though that's quite counterintuitive. The fifth one is computing is only for students with high prior attainment. And often you'll find in schools where they just decide that actually computing isn't for students with special educational needs and disabilities. But having taught, it's around about 1,500 students now, I know that students with special educational needs and disabilities can achieve, and that everyone can achieve from their base point. And it's not just for high prior attainment. Even if you take programming, for example, it's not necessarily the case. I don't think it's true that simply because you attain well in maths that you're going to do very well in computing. I found very little data to suggest that there's any link between, say, maths, languages maybe a little, music maybe a little. Certainly our students who have English as a second language, there's a relation to their performance in computing, perhaps because they're essentially just learning a third or a fourth language. And in terms of programming, they already understand syntax rules in two languages, so learning a third and a fourth might be easy as well. So I think all our preconceptions, and sometimes our senior leaders might say, you know what, these students, maybe they should be doing a softer subject. Maybe they shouldn't do computer science because computer science is hard. And I think that's really limiting, and students should be allowed to do what they want to do. Of course, we need to inform them, that for certain things they're going to find difficult, but we should be preparing them for that, and we shouldn't just close the door. I agree with Daniel Willingham, who said memory is the residue of thought. And I think that it's not the students with high prior attainment that do better in computing, it's those students who think about the work that they're doing and who are challenged and are constantly given things to think about, rather than it's just the students who already have high prior attainment. So those are the 5 fallacies from top level. I'm now going to move into the classroom and just talk about, on a micro level, where a few tips that we've got. So those were the 5 fallacies. But on a micro level then, I want to talk about what does good teaching look like in a computing classroom, and 5 ideas for you to try, based on mistakes that I've made and based on the things which I think kind of work. Modelling. So modelling is really important. And one of the reasons why is because many of us in this room are in this area here, unconscious competence. So you're very good at something, and you don't even realise that you're good at it. You're an expert, so you don't think that it's difficult, and you don't feel the need to explain that. And therefore, the trap here is that you do something without explaining it, and you assume that everyone else is just going to get it. And I think that's a bit of a trap. It's also the reason why some of the best football players don't necessarily make the best managers. And likewise, some of the best managers weren't necessarily the best football players. Because I think it's to do with empathy as well, that if you're in this kind of quadrant, you almost have to force the empathy. You have to really empathise. What would it look like to be a complete novice in this? What do I actually need to explain? And frequently the trap that experts fall into, like themselves, is just not explaining it well enough, not modelling it. As I spoke about earlier, we talked about a bit of research that Collins did in 1991 about cognitive apprenticeship. And his premise was based on practical things that people used to learn. Practical crafts like plumbing, or pottery, or say tailoring. So traditionally that was learned through a master and an apprentice. And what would happen is the master would be on the lathe, and as he was sculpting, the piece of wood for the piece of furniture, or as he was crafting a shoe, he would be explaining to the apprentice what they were doing, and he would be thinking aloud. And what Collins says is that actually the best teachers, this is something that the best teachers do, they think aloud. And unless we do that as we're teaching, the students will get lost. Because if you imagine just watching someone as they're plumbing, and you've probably done this when the plumber comes around, or when you watch someone, making jewellery or making woodwork or furniture, it just looks like magic. Like, wow, they did all this. And you also have that feeling that I could never do this, because it just seems really complicated. But with a master and apprentice kind of viewpoint, everything is possible, because you're explaining, you're thinking, all the things that are implicit, and you're making explicit. David Dinnow also explains this in his model for developing independence. And at the top left, he says that we should explain something like, this is what we're learning today. Then we need to model it. We need to deconstruct examples. So take a few examples of some really good graphic design, some mediocre graphic design, and some really poor graphic design, and take them apart. Why is this one really poor? Well, the alignment's all off, or the typefaces are too similar, or the colour balance is wrong. So by deconstructing it, the students get an idea of what's a good one look like. So they can see, oh, so I'm meant to be producing something more like this. Everyone can tell what, say, for example, a good poster or a good film trailer looks like, but very few people can explain why that is. And the expert teachers will model really, really well. At stage 3, we scaffold them, so there's joint construction. So together, you might say, for example, okay, let's have a go at this. Let's airbrush this. We'll use the clone tool, and I want us all just to work on this patch here, and we do it together. And then you might say, okay, independent construction. I want you now to go into this scene, and I want you to clone out all the birds from the sky. Or here's a program. having done this chatbot about, say for example, Roehampton University, I now want you to do one which is based on your family. I want you to ask some questions based on your family, or I want you to recreate a chatbot which might pretend that it's like a human being, like a Turing machine. The key caveat here is that anything that we scaffold, we must be prepared to take it back down. So when a building's built, you put the scaffolding up, but only in very rare cases, the shard being one of them, so they not take it back down. So inside the middle of the shard, there's a crane that they just left inside there. They call it a sacrificial crane, because the engineers feared that if they took it away, the thing might fall down. So only in the rarest cases do we scaffold and not take it away, but in most cases, we help the students achieve something, but our intention is that one day they'll be able to do it independently. Not, oh, we're just going to scaffold them through this course, they're going to pass all these exams, it'll be great. David Didau and Ollie Knight, who's also worked on this, says that that's not ideal, it has to be taken away. So that's called this apprentice. I suppose in my classroom, all of this kind of modelling could be enhanced with EdTech. I'm in two minds about EdTech. I think there's a lot of educational technology which is very expensive and is quite gimmickry and maybe doesn't really serve much of a purpose. However, a visualiser is a really good piece of, a document visualiser is a really good piece of educational technology. They cost about £100 or £200. In fact, there's one there. And you put your piece of work underneath it. It might be a program, it might be a student's book, it might be a flowchart, and you can annotate it in real time, so you're demonstrating your marking or you're demonstrating your thinking in real time. However, if £100 or £200 you don't have budget for that, you can just download free apps. So for example, on Android there's an app called DroidCam X, and the advantage of this is that they're mobile, so you can walk around the room with your phone, go up to each student's work, and then show on the board wirelessly what pupils are doing. So if they are, say for example, doing hand design sketches for a poster that they're about to draw, you might walk over to a student and say, I like how the student's using pencil, I like how they're using a ruler to draw out their lines, I like how everything's consistent and well labelled and annotated. And Apple, on the App Store, there's an app called EcoCam, which does exactly the same thing as well. And they're mobile, so that's like an added bonus.
There's a company called Hue, they do a sort of HD webcam on stick for about £30. I use one when I'm working, say, with my Arduino, so that they can see the different bits of the board up on the big board. Yeah, I find that, especially when you're talking about, let's say, the Arduino, or you want to go up close to a motherboard, there's no real way that if you took a photo of a motherboard, it's just very 2D, and if you try and get all the kids around a desktop computer, no one can really see anything. So these document cameras, like that one there, the Visualiser, allows you to be hands-free and talk about the architecture of the computer quite easily. So I think that's a really interesting one to discover as well. Classroom design. So classroom design, I read this post on a blog, and someone said that I learned about classroom design through going to the supermarket. And what they meant by that was that they commented on the fact that during the European Cup, or during, say, like the World Cup, the supermarket, managers will stack the shelves very strategically. So in some supermarkets, they'll put nappies at the aisle ends where the beer is, so that when dads walk past and pick up their beer, they remember also to buy the nappies, which I find a bit absurd. But I think that actually immersive education is really important. So in my classroom, we label all the desks with numbers. They're also labelled in binary, and the computers are as well. And that's like to fully immerse them in. So from the very moment they enter the classroom, they're already asking questions like, why are these ones and zeros here? What does that mean? Is that the same as the number that's there? And then we can actually go into discussions for that. Here you'll see that the computer's labelled in the same way. And then in my classroom, looking at Daniel Willingham's work, he says that actually a lot of learning fails to happen because there's too much restraint put on cognitive load. And so what I did in my classroom was, there was a spare projector that wasn't being used in the school, so essentially I literally just put 2 projectors in the room so that I can have the instructions on here, and they're numbered steps which get increasing, so they become increasing in complexity and increasing in higher order thinking skills.
And then on this projector here, that's where I might be modelling something live. So let's say, for example, I said these are the steps. Then on this projector, I might just be modelling the programming live. And that's a really, I think, economical and quick win solution. Like these portable projectors, I think are less than £100 now. And there are loads of projectors which are just lying around because now that we have these short throw ones, all the old ones people don't use. And so I found that using 2 projectors kind of helped. And it definitely reduces cognitive load. I heard about this school and I've heard about Google, where they have these tables which are made out of this non-porous, really shiny surface, so you can write on the tables. Well, that's a really cool idea, but I just don't think my head teacher would be okay with me writing on the tables. It's not really instilling good habits. So what I did was I took these sheets of plastic that are meant to be typically used to protect these notice boards and just stuck them on the wall. So when students, let's say for example, they ask me about constructs, and in this case they are building a quiz about capital cities, and they said, but I don't really understand like the logical or, why would we need that? So I said, well, you could do it with a logical or, so you could do if question 3 equals Washington, or question 3 equals Washington DC, or question 3 equals DC. Or what we could do is we could do a list and write it like this, and then we can just do if question 3 is Wash, then it's correct. And so by doing that, that's right by literally right by their computer. So they've got that there, that reduces cognitive load. They don't have to, I think Enrique spoke about not asking the students to remember everything, because it's not, computing isn't a memory test. There's certain things which actually, deconstruct how you make a list in, say, Python or Java or C or Ruby, it's going to be different than how you make an array. And actually remembering that, how much value is there in there? It's more important that they understand the logical thinking or the computational thinking, dare I say. So actually writing on the walls, we write on the windows quite a lot as well. And if you don't have a large enough wall space, you can just put mini whiteboards, next to the computer. That could be like a little notepad for some of the students. Number 3. So this was a really interesting piece of research. I think it was done by Karpik. It's also on the Daniel William blog. And in this experiment, they took 2 groups. In one group, they just studied for a term, studied for another term, and they took a test in the final group. In group 2, what they did is they studied, took a test, or took frequent tests, and then they took a test at the end. And they found that group 2 always outperformed group 1. And what this showed was that the testing effect, or what we call retrieval practice, is a really powerful way of students to learn. So it's kind of going into like the cognitive psychology of learning, really. The other thing that they found was that even if the people in group 2 got the questions wrong, provided that they were provided corrective feedback, they still outperformed group 1. So even if your students are here getting loads of questions wrong here, that's still better than group 1, who spent a lot more time studying. And that was research done by Rosalind and Potts. So they said effective learning has to come from testing and immediate or feedback as well, so corrective feedback. This is a graph to illustrate that. It's quite powerful because obviously, you've got students here who are almost making double the amount of progress as the students with no feedback. And this is further research by Butler, Karpik and Rodinger that shows the same. You look at students who get no feedback on a multiple choice question and they got it wrong, versus students who got feedback and they got it wrong the second time round. It was, 82% result. So I think it shows that actually the feedback is really important, and the testing effect tells us a lot about memory as well.
Can I just ask you something? Sorry. I mean, I no doubt these are brilliant research.
Yeah.
But there must be a point where there's a kind of a tipping point. I mean, you actually do have to teach stuff, don't you?
Yeah, sure.
You could say to you, well, if I just teach them stuff in lesson 1 and then test them every lesson after that for the rest of the term, that is not going to work.
No.
So what I would find more interesting, I don't know if you know the answer, and maybe it would probably differ according to what you're actually teaching, is like, what is the optimum balance between the amount of teaching you do and the amount of testing?
Yeah, so in the research that Karpik and Roehampton do, they talk about frequent low stakes testing. So we're talking about 5-minute quizzes at the end of every lesson or at the beginning of every lesson. They're not, so effectively if you have 1 hour lessons, they're saying it's better to do a 50-minute lesson and a 5-minute test, 50-minute lesson, 5-minute test, 50-minute lesson, 5-minute test, or to do the 5-minute test at the beginning, than, say, for example, just doing 1 hour lessons and putting it through there as well. Within the testing effect, they said that there were many different ways of learning keywords. So let's say, for example, a keyword like latency, which no students can know about at, say, age 11, because it's just completely foreign to them. And they said, well, which of these would enhance learning the most? Is it me giving you the definition? Is it them taking a guess and then getting corrective feedback? Or is it asking you to choose the correct definition from a list of multiple choices? And what they found was that those students who generated the answer, so just took a guess, even if it was a wild guess, and then they were corrected on that, they retained more information, or they were more likely to remember and learn the concept than students who were told to pick from multiple choice or who were given the answer. They have no idea why that is. So when Karpik and Roehampton did this, they said that perhaps it's because when you generate an answer from yourself, you have more personal buy-in. So you're more bought into the problem anyway because you've suggested something, and then the feedback you get is more meaningful for you. Common question, does guessing count as testing? So as I showed in the previous slide, they say that guessing does count as testing, so just getting kids to guess the answer, that's still testing because you're asking them to think. Can you overlearn? So they found that actually if they were learning keywords, and there was an experiment where they took keywords on cue cards, and each time they learned a correct word, they just put it down, and they didn't learn it again. So they were just left with the words that they didn't know. And they actually found that it wasn't possible to overlearn. That actually, if you learn something which you already knew, that would just further enhance it. So actually, there's no such thing as overlearning. Is all active learning the same? It's just concept mapping. So we're talking about passive learning versus active learning. So if we do a concept map, is that as powerful as, say, frequent testing? The studies show that frequent and low-stakes testing with immediate feedback is what works quite well.
I think there's a danger with, this idea of very frequent testing, that you end up focusing on sort of lower level, most banal areas of learning rather than higher order skills. Isn't that a danger with, making those tests 5 minutes for every lesson or whatever?
Sure. So
that you end up testing on, knowledge of vocabulary over creative.
I'm going to go to a live example just so that you can see
things that are hard to measure.
Sure. Let me go to a live example. So something which I used in my class yesterday. So for example, let's take these quizzes. So this is like an example of a quick quiz. So I suppose the first question is recall. The second one is also recall. The third one, I think that's definitely application. You're definitely going to have to do some thinking to do that. There's no way that you can just, come up with 10 unless you're remembering binary numbers. Convert 40 to binary, name this gate. So that is recall. What is the output? So here, I think that requires some thinking as well. Unless you're remembering truth tables, hardware device, admittedly that's recall. A security measure to prevent hacking on a network. That's probably recall as well. But then you've got this, describe this algorithm's operation. Is it either sequence, selection, or iteration? Or a series of sequences, selections, or iterations? If we just want to add 1 to the score variable, what would be right in Python? So I think that it doesn't necessarily, just because they're quick and low stakes, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're lower order thinking. I don't think. I mean, admittedly, there are quite a few recall questions, but it's worth noting that these quick quizzes that we do, I never take the marks from them. I never make a big deal about students who've got, say, 1 out of 8 or 10 out of 10. It doesn't really matter to me. The most important thing is that the students are aware of where their strengths and weaknesses lie, so they know what they need to revise. But there's quite, as you can see, there's quite a few. And there's a certain repetition in skill as well. This is obviously GCSE computing, so all the content is based around GCSE computing. So this is similar as well. I don't think this is recall. This requires some kind of thinking. Why do all computers use binary? Is it because it's shorter? And a lot of students say, oh, maybe it is. Is it because it's free? Is it because circuits say they need to check for 2 states? Or is it because it's easy for humans to read and understand? And sometimes students say this, well, it's only 0s and 1s, so we can understand it. And then we write out their name in binary and say, well, what's easier to understand? This string of 0s and 1s or your actual name? So I think there is a risk that it is a lot lower order thinking, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So 6 reasons why frequent latex testing is beneficial. Testing interrupts forgetting. We'll talk about the forgetting curve later on. It's easy to interleave topics, so you can mix topics up. Allows for testing to be cumulative, so you can build on previous testing and increase the complexity. Assessment for learning is the best proxy for learning. If we're talking about walking to the classroom, it's silent, and therefore you think, oh, this is a really good classroom, everyone's learning. You only really know that people are learning if you've actually tested them. And the students will be able to tell you, you know what, sir, I don't really get this binary question. And they're not afraid to admit it because they know that you're not taking the marks. So they can openly say, I didn't really get that. We talk about an eye test. So I say to students, when you go to the opticians to get an eye test, can you fail it? And they say, no. It's different to a driving test. It's not like pass or fail. The purpose of the eye test is to help you see better. And the purpose of these diagnostic tests is to help me to teach you better. So that's the best way for you. So if it highlights to me what you can't see, and I'm there to kind of like provide the glasses to help you see better and understand things better. So make sure it's low risk, generating a culture of error where it's okay to make errors. And apparently the gains increase with frequency. So Joe Kirby, who talks a lot about cognitive science, he says that a lot of schools will organise their units like this, and then have one-off assessments at the end. And he says that's completely against what cognitive science tells us. And so I adapted his version for computer science. So we could, in Year 7, teach binary, hardware programming, online safety, graphic design and revision, or actually we could teach data representation. We teach computer systems, then in that we also talk about data representation. When we teach programming then, we can write programs which convert from binary to hex and hex to denary. When we go on to online posters, we're still talking about data representation, so we talk about image manipulation and how that is still stored in binary. Memory and data representation, so that's based on computer systems and data representation. Then term 6, we revise everything together, and that's punctuated with probably not that many frequent quizzes, to be honest. But that model is very different to this one. I think some teachers, including myself, would fall into this trap of doing discrete units. But what cognitive science tells us is actually interleaving and having cumulative units is better. Interleaving as a concept seems quite counterintuitive. So most of us would teach like this, topic 1, topic 2, topic 3, topic 4. Whereas in chunking, you would literally iterate through the topics and constantly interweave them to enhance learning as well. How can we apply this? This concept of do nows comes from Doug Lemolf, and it's kind of a technique which is similar to a starter, but doing frequent quick quizzes, getting students to create gap fills, plausible multiple choice questions where the distractors are equally as valid as the correct answer, making flashcards, writing exam questions, and mark schemes. This is to do with the forgetting curve. So what this says is that we forget very quickly. If we learn a concept, the likelihood is we'll forget it in a day. If we then revisit it, the likelihood is we'll forget it, or it'll get to 80% competence or retention in 3 days. And the more frequently we revisit something, the more frequently we're going to retain this. And this is a theory of distributed practice or spacing. And the reason why spacing works is because spacing leads to forgetting time. And this means that each time you try and retrieve that memory is a lot more difficult, and that helps you remember, because learning, as Rob Coe would say, is actually really, really difficult. The paradoxical finding is that some approaches that may appear to make learning harder in the short term and less satisfying for learners actually result in better long-term retention. So there's a lot of paradoxes and counterintuitive thinking as to what actually makes for good teaching and learning. And I think I've certainly learned a lot about teaching and learning through my mistakes and through, reading around the research as well. Ebbinghouse's spaghetti curve, which we just saw, this is kind of amplified whereby, provided that the revisits are done in greater distances apart, the actual retention of that information is quite high. And I'd say that, whilst I agree with Enrica's point that it's not a memory test, I still think that there's certain things which students just have to remember. So students have to remember, for example, what the different logic gates are, what each one is. I think, is it important that they know how the syntax of falling? Probably not. I don't think that that's really, really important. They could look that up, that's fine. But there's certain things that they just need to recall straight away. And therefore, there are certain things which I do think that students need to remember. So I'm kind of in two worlds about this. I don't think that computing is a memory test, but at the same time, I do think that certain things do need to be remembered. So I suppose applying this then, this is based on John Hatties' work, I believe, and he looked at things which make the most difference, and he found that practice testing, distributed practice, in-sleeve practice, self-explanation, elaborative interrogation, these were things which maximise learning and actually giving feedback to students. So it's Dunlowski's work. Whereas other things, ironically, highlighting is not very useful for learning, even though on this slide by John Webber he's highlighting things. We talk about rereading, and a lot of kids say, oh, I'm just going to highlight a book, or I've read all my notes, therefore I've revised. And actually, Dunlowski, in improving students' learning, says actually that has very low utility compared to testing yourself, spacing things out, interleaving topics. That has a much better lasting effect on learning. So in summary, these are what I think are the 7 habits of highly effective teachers. Not just computing teachers, but I think teaching in general. I think number 1, we have to make mistakes. We have to embrace them and learn from them and encourage our students to do the same. Number 2, I think we need to keep reflecting, not only when things go right, but not only when things go wrong, but also when things go right, and the trap to fall into is, everything went well, great. Why can't I reproduce that? Well, it's probably because you didn't reflect on why it worked in the first place. You didn't really drill down into what was so effective. And model everything and assume nothing. So, literally the best teachers model really, really well. They explain their thinking really, really well. 4, make your classroom immersive. So like supermarket design. If you came to my classroom, you'd see a lot of writing on the walls, a lot of posters of different heroes in computing, and a lot of, let's say, display work as well. But making it really immersive, test frequently, and provide feedback, which is probably the most important one, providing feedback according to John Hattie. Interleaving topics and building a cumulative curriculum, and then lastly to review to prevent forgetting. And that's it. I think.
That's good, thanks. You know the reflection on where you've done well?
Yes.
Well, the interesting thing is, because I always try and reflect, is that if someone says to me something like, I really, really like that last blog post, I'll always ask why. But possibly because I'm English, I always say, I'm not after an ego trip.
Yeah.
I just would really like to know what you found valuable in it. Because then hopefully I can keep doing more of that and I learn from it. It's actually quite difficult. It's a lot more easy to learn from your mistakes, I think.
Yeah, sure. Because the mistakes are usually huge blunders, like you forgot to print the resources, you forgot to install the software, you set the wrong question, or you assume that you taught them, say, binary, and therefore you can teach a binary addition, whereas actually you missed that lesson in sequence. So those mistakes are a lot more glaring, but it's quite easy to reflect and say, okay, this is what I need to do differently. Whereas when things are going well, you probably don't ask as many questions ourselves. I don't know if there's any other questions.
Are you writing your multiple choice tests as your separate?
Yes, those ones are. I'm also part of the quantum working group. So, but most of those will go into quantum. For people that are not on Computing at Schools group, there's a group called Quantum. It's led by Rob Coe and this is really embarrassing. Tim Oates, that's right. And they're writing a series of multiple choice questions on the website diagnosticquestions.com, I think it is. But they're crowdsourcing them because a lot of teachers are just repeating this. I have literally hundreds of multiple choice questions that other people may have already written. So yeah, and it's not just multiple choice. The focus is on short questions. They're looking at doing longer extended answers and having a bit of AI in there to detect whether the answer is correct or not. So yeah, I think we're really lucky in computing because there's such a large group of teachers that are all contributing to the sphere of education and computing. And the networks, the Computing at Schools network, is really powerful. Yeah. Any other questions?
Can I do another one?
Yeah.
So, the list on the screen there, is there anything there which is unique to computing, or is this really just highly effective teaching in general?
Yeah,
what's different about us?
That's a really good question. So Elizabeth Hidson, she's doing research at the moment on pedagogical content knowledge in computing at the University of Durham. And so far, I think her research is still in early stages, but she's looking at, is computing pedagogy any different from, say, ICT or English? From personal reflection, because her research isn't yet published, I'd say that, to be honest, my head teacher, Ollie Knight, would say that modelling is really important in all subjects. I suppose in computing, it's a lot easier to hide that. It's not very natural to be talking through as you script something in HTML or as you program something. It's just really weird to be talking as you're typing. And so that's quite unnatural. So I think this is the one that is often neglected. Making mistakes, I think all good teachers do that as well.
Yeah, but we do a lot of that in computing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So number 3 would only be not done well if you actually, as a teacher, knew what the answer to the problem was. So, I mean, for example, I set a year 10 a problem.
Yeah.
And one of them said, how could you do this in BASIC? How could you... And I said, I haven't got a clue.
Yeah.
I said, we need to work on it together. Let's try this, let's try. The amazing thing was, because I thought when I said that, there'd be uproar, call yourself a teacher. But it wasn't. I mean, everyone just took it as normal.
Yeah.
But I don't think... And I think that's easier to do if you don't know the answer yourself.
Yeah,
if you know where you're getting to, then it feels really weird to kind of talk it out loud.
Yeah, I think students quite like that when you admit that you don't know. They're like that. So even Sir doesn't know. That's definitely a problem worth solving. Sir doesn't know it, and he's willing to commit energy to solve it. It must be worthwhile, because maybe I'll be able to do something that he can't do. And I found that, I say 5 or 6 years ago, I taught students, and I taught media studies then, and we were using Final Cut Pro, and a student wants to create a video wall, and it just wasn't really working in Final Cut. So we had Adobe After Effects, and he just taught himself. And now he edits shorts and trailers for Hollywood. So he's far exceeded where I am. And he works into new and
I mean, when you're talking about modelling there, you are talking about modelling the process rather than modelling what you're actually going to end up with as
I think both. Modelling the process is really important, but actually deconstructing models, so this is what a good one looks like, is also quite important.
Right. Yeah, because really the valuable thing is the process, isn't it?
Yes.
That's the bit that they can take forward. That's the thing that's useful, because most people weren't taught.
No. It's how they get from A to B. They don't really understand that. Yeah.
They weren't taught it, they learned themselves.
Sure.
And so that process of being able to model how you can solve that problem, you can do all of that process of...
And I think that's why it's also quite unnatural, is because a lot of us learned our computing through self-trial and error. We were just self-taught. So we weren't necessarily taught it formally, it was through exploration. So to put that into like coherent words is quite difficult as well.
But that's, I mean, but in some ways that's quite common. Certainly, primary, the idea of shared writing, and has been something that's been going on for quite a while in terms of composing something together with the class. So actually, the model could be very similar in programming.
I went to one school, it was Tudor Grange Academy, and they did shared programming, not pair programming, but shared programming, where they'd each just write a line, one line at a time, and the teacher would talk through it, and that's quite nice as well.
May I just say, I really, really enjoyed this presentation, which is pretty good considering I'm knackered.
I'm really tired, I had to have a nap earlier.
But to take up your number 2 then, or number 1 it might be, what I particularly enjoyed was all the references to the research and everything. And I thought that was really good because it gives some kind of solidity. It's not just you kind of, what you thought
I think
this morning.
I think
it might have been, but it sounded good. I just wondered if you have a list of...
I do. I can send that. I can probably send you my script. It has all the links. Because I mean, I'm kind of writing a book at the moment, so that's why I have all the research there anyway. But I can definitely send you this script. It's got all the research papers in there. And I think I probably have a lot of these research papers on my computer. I can probably send you a few of those. But I mean, these... I've got your email address. I'll send you them. But I think these pages are definitely worth visiting, like Pragmatic Reform, Joe Kirby's blog. He's an English teacher, but his work on cognitive science is really amazing. It changed the way I thought about teaching. In terms of curriculum planning, Ollie Knight and David Benson wrote a book about creating outstanding classrooms, and they talk about how you structure your curriculum, and that was quite powerful as well. I'll show you that actually. So if you take a look at I'll give you time, we're running short time. This will be the last thing I show you, I suppose. So in terms of a curriculum map, they talk about having these fertile questions. So for example, here, how can we design the fastest computer system in the world? And that's a question which you can't necessarily answer straight away. It's something that's engaging. And it's something that they deal with whilst they're studying computer systems. So, for example, is it really important that you have a snazzy mouse? Is it really important you have lots of RAM? Should you have an 8-core CPU? Is it important that you have a graphics? I don't know. So we explore that, and these questions are meant to be not easy to answer. So are we ever safe online? Can we accurately model the world using computer software? What can we model, what can't we model? So it's quite, their way of curriculum planning has also changed the way I think that actually each term and each unit revolves around something like how can we think more like a computer? Should we think more like a computer? Things like that. But yeah. I can send my slides. Yasmin definitely has them, so I emailed them to her, and I'll post it online. Okay. Well, I won't take up any more of your time.
Thanks very much.